Yeah.
Are we live? Are we live?
Yeah, because a couple of them were like it was just my face right in the front of them. That's why I started using images to put as like the main kind of thumbnail for the video on a lot of them, because it was just my face like right there. I was like, well, nobody wants to see that. All right, so what we have been talking about for a while now on Wednesdays was we went through Revelation chapter 1. It took us a couple days, a couple Wednesdays, but we did it, and then we went through each church in chapters 2 and 3 individually. And we took a big pause to talk about the rapture. So we've accomplished that, and what we're doing now is moving forward in the book of Revelation, and we're going to chapter 4. So the reason why I did it, if it wasn't clear, I think I said this at one point anyway, was I'm just going to read all 11 verses. It's a short chapter, so I'm just going to read all 11 verses, and then we'll talk about them individually. So it says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet, talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. He that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne, and sight like unto an emerald. And round about the throne were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. And out of the throne proceeded lightnings, and thunderings, and voices. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal. And in the midst of the throne, and round about the throne, were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion. The second beast was like a calf. The third beast had a face as a man. And the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. And the 4 beasts had each of them 6 wings about him. And they were full of eyes within. And they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. And when those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne, and worship him that liveth forever and ever, cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. So the reason why I chose to break and do a pause and said, let's talk about rapture, was because the pre-tribulation theory on that, with verse 1 and 2, is that that's the rapture taking place. So that's why I felt such a need to, before I go any further, the rapture needs discussed. So we did that, we took care of that, and we discussed and had a lot of good discussions on that. So what I'd like to point out with is where it says, after this I looked, and behold. The word it opens up with 2 words. It says metatauta. And what that means, after these things, is behind, beyond, or after a place or time. So that being said, and remembering that the chapters and verses were added later, much later, to the Bible, that a lot of people, and I agree that I agree with the pre-tribulationists to a certain extent on this, that they say, okay, well, what he's talking about is that after the age of the church, when we're raptured up, is what he's meaning, metatauta. I'll agree with you to a certain extent, but what I think more so is a better explanation is, at some point the church age as we know it will come to an end, and God will primarily be wanting to deal with his children, Israel, in the last week of Daniel. 70 weeks, I've appointed for your people. We believe there's 1 more week left. There's 1 more week that God really wants to deal with Israel and the Jewish people. So I think to a certain extent what they're saying is true, but not to the extent that they say, well, this is the church being raptured out. I think the church can exist and be completely and totally fine in their existence, but God's primary, purpose and what He's wanting is to deal with Israel, to draw them and the church kind of into one. Because that's His ultimate goal, is to bring the Israelites, and that last week His ultimate goal is to bring Israel back into Him under the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And we talked about that extensively when we went over in Zechariah. We talked about that extensively because Zechariah deals hard on it. It deals with the blessings that are coming to Israel. It deals with the awful things that are going to come to Israel. It deals with them killing Jesus. It deals with Jesus coming back to them, saying, "You shall look upon Him whom you have pierced." All of those things Zechariah deals with. Wonderful book. Love it. I recommend strongly, for Christians to really be familiar with it. And actually, I think if you were to really want to be good at maybe like even evangelizing Jews, that the Book of Zechariah would be a really good place to start. A lot of times, it's a story of a pastor. He's on a plane when he goes in and out of Israel, and of course, if you're on a plane to Israel, you would expect there to be some Jews on the plane with you. And he said he was reading his Bible, and one Jewish guy's passing by him, and he says, "Hey, what are you reading?" And he said, "Oh, just reading the Bible." And he says, "Oh, okay." And he says, "Actually," he said, "I'm reading the Tanakh." So he used a Jewish, a Hebrew word to talk to him. And he said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Where are you at?" And he said, "I'm at Zechariah." He said, "I have a question for you real quick here. Could you look at this?" And he pointed out where, how it capitalizes Lord. There's Adonai, and then there's Jehovah or Yahweh, Jehovah, however it's pronounced. We don't know for sure. But the proper name of God, there's Lord and Lord. One of them's generic, one of them's specific. Well, it says specific Lord in there, and then it says, "They shall look upon me whom they pierced." He said, "What does this mean?" He was just kind of trying to take a moment to maybe evangelize or to get him to think or whatever, and he said that guy quickly got up from him so quick it wasn't even funny. It was that he was like he had a disease. He got up from him so fast. But it's a good book for that reason, because you have to deal with it. You can't read Zechariah and not have to deal with something when it comes to God, or when it comes to Jesus. You just have to see it. You talk about Him being betrayed. Not to get on another tirade about Book of Zechariah. Sorry, I love Zechariah. So, anyway, so I have no problem with this theory that this is after the age of the church as we know it. That this is after the age of the church as what we would think and know it. And we know that at some point the time of the Gentiles has to end, where He deals with Israel. But I don't necessarily agree with them on the pre-tribulation part of that. So it says, "A door was opened in heaven. The first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me." Very interesting about that. The first voice as if it were a trumpet. Because if you look at, let's see, I think it's John chapter 12, kind of the talking and voice as if it were a trumpet talking with me. And it kind of comes into this later as well when it gets to verse 5, just to skip ahead. Out of the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. I think it's kind of cool that they're comparing the voice that they're hearing around the throne with trumpets, very loud, stark noises. You get what I'm saying? Like very loud, thundering voices, things that really kind of... Because if somebody blows a trumpet and they're standing right beside you, that kind of goes and drives in right there. It's a very powerful thing, or a big powerful thunderstorm. I thought that was pretty interesting because if you remember in John chapter 12, verse 23, Jesus answered them, saying, "The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified." And he says a whole items of things here, and then in the 28th verse he goes on to say, "Father, glorify thy name." Then came there a voice from heaven saying, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." The people therefore that stood by and heard it said that it thundered. Others said an angel spake to them. So I thought that was kind of a cool, not necessarily saying that it's the exact same thing going on, but I think it's a cool comparison anyway to look at. The idea of voices being thundering or trumpet-like in their echo and in their kind of shock value, you could say. And it goes on to say, he says, "Come up hither, and I will show you the things which must be hereafter." And immediately I was in the Spirit. Now this is another problem I have with this when it comes to with the pre-tribulation argument. They say John right here represents the church, and that this is John being raptured up. Well, it says "come up hither." It doesn't say harpazo, number one. So it uses a different word altogether. It doesn't say that he stole them out. It says that he told them to come here. There's a big difference between me walking up to my kid and just picking him up and me saying, hey son, come here. You know what I mean? You can't necessarily say they're the same act based upon the language. So that's a problem I have with number one, is that that's not what the language is saying. And the other part is that you tell me that the rapture is bodily physical, which I agree with, but then it says that he was in the Spirit. Every other example we have of rapture in the Bible, Enoch, Elijah, Jesus himself, all of that was physical. So, you know what I mean? It's kind of a thing of pick one please, and choose it. So, John here, I have no problem in this just being a vision of John going up into heaven spiritually and being shown a vision, just like it's been done to many other prophets. Isaiah, the same thing, and I'll get to that in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah kind of gets a similar thing. But yet they don't say, oh, Isaiah was raptured out. That's not what they say about Isaiah in chapter 6 of that book. So I don't think that you can say that same thing. So immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. So basically, some people refer to this as the throne chapter, because it says throne over and over again. So John's getting a nice sneak peek at the throne. And he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne in sight like unto an emerald. Kind of interesting where it says there was a rainbow around about the throne. Somebody kind of pointed this out, and there's many ways that men can kind of mock the color spectrum, what we would call the color spectrum. Of the colors, we can use light and water and kind of mimic it, but there's only one way to put it actually up in the clouds, and it has to come down from above. And kind of use that same analogy to talk about when God made that covenant with mankind, the descendants of Noah, and said, I will never flood the world again. It was a blessing that came from the top down. And that when Jesus comes again, it'll be a blessing from the top down. I thought that was kind of an interesting little side note anyway. And it says, and round about the throne were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. So the big question here is, who are the 24 elders? Again, I know we already talked about the rapture, but not to kind of get into more pre-tribulation, what I would call, not necessarily errors, but assumptions. They say that the church here is the 24 elders, because they say there's one place where it talks about it's in Chronicles, where it talks about where David kind of sections the Levites off and says, and he makes them in like 24 sections. And basically, they say that because that's the priesthood, the church is now the priesthood, that's got to be the church. Well, that's a pretty wild assumption, because I also have another one that's pretty good. Think about the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel, we know that one of those tribes is kind of cursed, I guess you might say. They are kind of just casted out, the tribe of Dan, for their sin. And if you go in to read maybe 11 and like 14, it's in there a couple times, I think, where it talks about the 12 tribes of Israel. Maybe it was 11. I can't remember. 14 maybe. I can't remember offhand, but where it talks about the tribes of Israel in Revelation, it leaves out Dan, and it replaces them with kind of gets replaced with the sons of Joseph, kind of replaced that, where Joseph got the double portion. So that's interesting to me that you had 12, one got replaced. When you think about the disciples, you had 12. When it came time to be apostles, one gets replaced. Even though everybody became an apostle except for one, got replaced by Matthias. And so there's already kind of that ebb and flow, I guess you could say, of the elders of the tribes of Israel as well as the apostles. They already kind of have a balancing act on each other, that representative of each other. Also, to note, in Revelation chapter 19, maybe. Sometimes I don't write verses down or chapters down on my notes. I'm like, oh, I'll remember what specific chapter that is when I get there. And then you get there and you're like, oh, I should have wrote that down. So, maybe it wasn't 19. That's because it's 21. Okay, chapter 21, verse 12. And it's talking about, the description up top is about the heavenly Jerusalem. And chapter 21 starts out, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. And it goes through the whole spill there about a new Jerusalem. And when you get to verse 12, it says, and had a wall great and high, and had 12 gates. And at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. And then it says on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, south 3 gates, west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them, what's it say? The names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So I think that that's highly more likely, as well as probably the correct one. I'm not saying that the other one can't be true, but for that to be true, you kind of have to subscribe to the whole pre-tribulation rapture, which I'm not all in on that by any means. So I think that there's just some problems with that whole logic of the beginning of chapter 4 here. I think that the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles are a lot more likely to be. Especially considering the Jewishness of Revelation. I think that it almost has to be that. Could be wrong, but that's my opinion. I don't know if anybody else had a differing opinion on that, maybe. But, they're clothed in white raiment. Remember the blessings that Jesus, I think one of the churches in Revelation, I meant to look at that to double check, but I'm pretty sure one of the 7 churches, one of their blessings was that they would be clothed in white. And we know that Jesus is also seen in Revelation when described to the churches as being clothed in white. So, he paid it for us, and we'll wear the robe of righteousness because he already paid our way in. He paid our way through the door. So, what they also do is it says they have crowns of gold on their head. And we know that Jesus is one of the blessings promised to one of the churches that they would receive crown of life, and I think there was a couple other different crowns mentioned throughout the Bible, kind of in blessings. I meant to double check that. And sometimes you don't write it down, and then you start to get too many different thoughts in your head, or where you feel like, oh, I think I need to spend more time on this, and then you never go back and check the other. Oh yeah, here, behold, I come quickly, hold that fast, which thou hast. No man take thy crown. So it says, what church is that? That's to the church of Philadelphia. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon the whole world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast. No man take thy crown. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God. So we see that the blessing of believers will be crowned, and we know that ultimately the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, they are believers in Jesus, and they will ultimately have the same reward that we will, as far as white raiment and crown. We'll kind of share those things together. Now, it seems that they have some special seating that we might not have, but so out of the throne proceed lightnings and thunderings and voices. We kind of talked about this already. I kind of talked about the similarities of when the voice came down from heaven, and some said it was thundering, and some said, oh, no, that's the voice of angels. Kind of that same repeat of a real loud, powerful voice coming from the throne. And there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Now, some people have kind of used this to say that there is 9 people in the Trinity. I think Benny Hinn might have been one of them. I had to go back and try to find that video where he's because this is agreed upon that this is the Holy Spirit it's talking about, and the 7 just represents the completeness or the 7 characteristics of the Holy Spirit. And what he kind of took and did was said that there was 9 in the Trinity, because he said, well, you've got 2 and you've got seven spirits of God, there must be 9, and that is pretty silly. It's more like 7 characteristics. When it talks about the churches and the beginning of Revelation, it talks about the 7. He holds the 7 candles. It's 1 lamp, but it's 7 candles. You know, it's still 1 lamp. It's still 1 Holy Spirit. It's just 7 characteristics, you could say. And I'm trying to remember where that was. If you remember when we were going over chapter 1, because I believe that's in chapter 1 of Revelation as well. I read from Isaiah, and where a lot of people think it gave the, here it is. And chapter 11 of Isaiah, there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. So you have the Spirit of God, or the Spirit of Yahweh, Jehovah, the Spirit of wisdom, the Spirit of understanding, the Spirit of counsel, the Spirit of might, the Spirit of knowledge, the Spirit of fear. A lot of people believe that those are the 7 characteristics. Of course, you have to count the Spirit of the Lord being the first one, and then there being the following 6: wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord. Where a lot of people kind of say, well, maybe that's kind of the 7 faces of it, the 7 characteristics of what we're talking about here. Could be. I don't believe there's anything probably in Revelation that isn't somewhere else in the Bible. I think pretty much anything that you can find here. I've always said the best way to interpret the Bible is the Bible, and I don't think there's anything that you're really going to find in here that you probably can't get a good idea or a good grasp on something from somewhere else in the Scripture. So it goes on to say, and before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal. To me and to some others, when it says a sea of glass, when we think of a sea, we think of, what do you kind of think of? You think of the waves kind of beating up against the shore. Well, this one's a sea of glass, so it shows the calmness, and that it's not moving. And honestly, it also makes me think of when Jesus calms the storm. I wonder if that's what the disciples that were with him when that happened, if that's what they saw, just a perfect flattening of the water. And what that would look like as far as a big body of water. We see that, you can see that in a glass of water, you know what I mean, but you don't see that on a big, large scale. That'd be really interesting to see.
That's something I was going to kind of point out. How often do you actually see perfectly calm water?
Yeah.
Even when I do on a lake, it's usually starting to gather scum. But here you have it perfectly clean.
Perfectly clean, perfectly still.
Yeah.
And what some people think, and I agree with them, is that kind of represents the peace and the perfectness and the clarity that's being represented on the throne and around the throne. Very possible, very possible. And in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. Now, why they have eyes before and behind, you would think that it just sort of represents being able to see clearly, being able to see and know all, kind of everything that's going on around them. And that's what I would think. If you start to talk about somebody with eyes in the front and back, you would kind of think, well, they're able to see clearly because they can see everything. So it goes on to describe these beasts. It says the first beast was like a lion, the second beast was like a calf, The third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. So there's a lot of, not necessarily saying that those are exactly what those beasts are like, because it says it's kind of like so that could be kind of figurative in what they're talking about with the way that they word that. But who knows? I mean, some people might like to say more exactly about why each of those beasts were chosen to be described, but I'm just going to continue reading. It says, the four beasts had each of them 6 wings about them, and they were full of eyes within. So it lets you know that there's a lot of eyes there. They rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. So that kind of gives us another reminder from Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 6, which I kind of already hinted at just a little bit of where Isaiah gets a look at the throne. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims, each one had 6 wings. So we know that John's kind of affirming the things that Isaiah has already told us. And again, that's where I don't think that you're going to read anything in Revelation that you can't find somewhere else. The question is finding where it's at, or the correct place of where it's at, because there's a couple of places where you can say, well, it could be this right here, it could be this right here. But nonetheless, I think everything would be found elsewhere in the Bible. So it talks about the 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, with twain he covered his feet, with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another, and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is filled with his glory. And the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. So again, you have that, where it says the posts of the door moved at the voice of him. You kind of have that impression of a very powerful, very thundering, very echoing voice, very dominant. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing you see almost kind of replayed out as well. A couple of slight different variations in the description of it, but cool nonetheless that you see that. I want to point out this though. I think that this is the cool part. Notice how calm John is about being where he's at. He has no problems with being where he's at, and he's just looking around, taking it all in, and learning from the Lord. This is what Isaiah's case is. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. John doesn't say that. And I could only suspect from the scriptures that the reason why he doesn't say that is because John's a believer in Jesus, and that Jesus has paid that way and that privilege. I go to prepare a place for you. We know that if he goes to prepare a place for us, he'll come again. And I can only come to the conclusion that the reason why John's able to stand where he's at is because he's a believer in Jesus, and that his sins have been paid for already, and that John has accepted that. So I thought that was really cool to see as well. The difference between before Jesus' death and resurrection to after Jesus' death and resurrection. You've got 2 people that are seeing the same thing, and ultimately you're talking about 2 men of God. You know, Isaiah is a man of God. There's a lot of scriptures in Isaiah. Isaiah is kind of like the 5th gospel, but yet he was seen as unclean to be where he was at. John seems to be allowed where he's at, and that's the thing. The only thing I can think of is that it's because Jesus has already died and resurrected at this point, and allowed him that privilege to be where he's at. So he's there because of Jesus. So let's see, where am I at? Verse 8. Am I verse 8? And the 4 beasts, okay, I already read verse 8. Verse 9, and when those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him that sat on the throne, who liveth forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him that sat on the throne, and worship him that liveth forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the thrones, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Notice that these people that have a glorified position, it would seem, they've got a crown, they're sitting on a seat, they kind of throw that away, and they throw it away. Why? They throw it away for the Holy One. They say, no, this is yours, and they throw their crowns down at his feet, You're the only reason why we're here. This is it. This is your show. You're the one. You're the reason. So you see that even these men in their glory, they recognize that it's not their own glory. That this glory is there because of Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. That He's the one that has given them this. And that's how we should be in our own lives, you know. And that's one thing that I think it's Paul, when Paul talks about being a pastor, is that you often don't want a brand new Christian to be a pastor, because they can get into trouble where they start to lean on themselves a little too much, and they get a little high-minded of their calling, and they say, oh, well, I'm here because of myself. Well, these men quickly recognize, I'm not here because of myself, I'm here because Jesus, and they throw the crowns down at His feet, and they say, this is your glory, this is all you. Notice something here, for thou hast created all things. It doesn't seem like there's any Darwinists in heaven at this point, does it? Thou hast created all things. That's one of the things that they admit when throwing down their crowns. I think that's there's a lot to be said about that. You kind of have this problem, and the Catholic Church, I think, has already gone that way, where they say it's okay to believe in evolution and be a Christian, that you can believe that God used evolution to create, if that's how you would like to believe that. But if you disagree with the very opening statement of the Bible, and you disagree with the very opening few chapters there, you kind of have to wonder, well, what else are you disagreeing with? What else are you kind of just saying, oh, that's just kind of figurative language? You know, well, you can tell when something is figurative, because he says the first beast was like a lion. The second one was like a calf. The one was like a flying eagle. Those are figurative languages, because it's saying like. It was similar to it. It was like it. But it doesn't say that in Genesis, and it doesn't say that in John when it says in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It doesn't say that. You know, it just says this is what it was. So I think that's kind of important to note too, that you talk about some of the things of the errors of men as we've kind of progressed through time, and you can only see the bigger progression that we keep attacking the very early things that God set out. So you saw the attack in the 60s and 70s, you kind of see the attack happening with sexuality, and you see sexuality being kind of thrown out, you know, just being promiscuous. Well, then you see it kind of turn into lesbian and gay stuff, and then you just kind of see this progression step. You see it now stepping into, it's no longer just about the lesbian gay stuff, it's now also about the transgender stuff. So it's like each time you just keep kind of taking away more and more that God set up at the beginning. And that's certainly also the case when it comes to creation. They just kind of, well, what else can we take? What else can we take? What else can we take? And they just keep taking and taking and taking to try to pull more and more away from God. And I can't help but notice that that's one of the things that these people, these 24 elders, admit right out in the open to God right here. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So that's chapter 4. Only 11 verses, not too much as far as material goes. Anybody have anything they want to know? So it's chapter 20 or chapter 4 is kind of a lot more. I feel like it's more straightforward than, and you don't have to quite go into detail like on some of the other stuff. But all right, I'll stop there.